I am a planner at the Portland Bureau of Planning and Sustainability, and I am working on a project that is known as the Public Infrastructure Environmental Code Project. And I have a presentation that I would like to talk to you about today. So I'm going to start with an introduction to the project, some background about why this project is happening. I'll give you a brief background and introduction to environmental overlay zones. I will talk to you about how the environmental zones work. I'll describe the proposed amendments to the zoning code that are proposed in this project, and then I'll conclude with some information about how you can get involved and provide comment. So what is this project? What is the Public Infrastructure Environmental Code Project? This is a set of amendments to Portland's environmental zones. These amendments are all about the code. We're not making any mapping changes to the zones. And the purpose of these amendments is to allow the maintenance, upgrade, and replacement of public infrastructure, and for the management of vegetation on city property. So why are amendments for public infrastructure needed? Public infrastructure serves a lot of important functions. Infrastructure delivers water to people's houses. It cleans up and deals with the waste that we produce. It prevents floods from occurring, amongst other things like transportation, and all kinds of other things that public infrastructure does. Many of the public infrastructure facilities that we have in Portland are decades old and are long overdue for upgrades or replacement. So what are environmental zones? Environmental zones are part of our zoning code that are applied to Portland, to important natural resources. Those resources include rivers and streams, wetlands, forests, and other important vegetation. We have different types of environmental zones that apply in different areas. The areas that I have circled here are where we have what are known as the conservation zone and the protection zone. That's our most widely mapped zone. And then in the far southeast corner of the city, we have the Pleasant Valley zone. Also around the Willamette River, we have the River E river overlay. And so these different zones, they respond to the different contexts of the areas where they're applied. The river overlay recognizes that there are important commercial and industrial functions that occur on the Willamette River, but it's also a very important natural resource. Also, people live on the river, but the resource itself provides habitat for threatened and endangered species, including threatened and endangered runs of salmon and steelhead that come up and down the river and migrate through the area. And so the different zones have just different code that responds to the context of the areas where they're applied. Most of the changes that we're proposing are to the conservation and protection zone. The only time that we're doing anything in this project with the Pleasant Valley or river overlay is to maintain consistency in some areas where the codes are intended to be consistent with each other. So how do the environmental zones work? So environmental zones protect natural resources by limiting or restricting the removal of trees, by preventing the removal of native vegetation without city approval or permitting. They prohibit the use of heavy machinery or equipment outside of a permitted activity. And there are prohibitions on exterior industrial activities or hazardous chemical storage. They involve rules and regulations that allow some limited development to occur on sites that have environmental zones. There's a difference between the conservation zone and the protection zone. The conservation zone is more permissive. It's easier to get approval to do development within the conservation zone, whereas the protection zone is very restrictive. So restrictive that most activities, development activities within the protection zone are either subject to environmental review, or if it's private development that's proposed within the protection zone, in most cases, private development is prohibited within that zone. So it's our most strict zone that's applied to the most important natural resources. So to get approval to do development within the environmental zones, there's two pathways. One is to meet established criteria in the code. These criteria we refer to as standards. So if you can meet standards, then it's a very simple process to get approval for your development. If you can't meet standards, then you have to go through a discretionary land use review. And in environmental overlay zones, that type of land use review is an environmental review. So how do you meet standards? As I said, there's some criteria that are set forth in the code that you have to meet. The criteria include setbacks from water bodies like rivers, streams, and wetlands. There are limits on the total disturbance area that you can make within the E-zone, so you have to stay within those limits. And there are requirements that if you impact trees or native vegetation, that you need to replace those features. And if you can meet the standards, then your development proposal would be approved through what's known as a plan check. It's fairly inexpensive, fairly quick to complete, and fairly straightforward. Again, if you can't meet the standards, if the plan check determines that you don't meet standards, then you go into the environmental review process. Environmental review requires applicants to assess all of the impacts that are on natural resources that would occur as a result of the proposed development. Applicants are required to propose a series of alternatives that consider all possible different layouts on the site. And then applicants have to work with a plan reviewer to identify the least impactful alternative. Applicants have to propose a mitigation plan that would offset all of the unavoidable impacts to the natural resources, such as native vegetation, and the types of mitigation that could occur are planting native vegetation or removing invasives. And then finally, the decision on whether a proposal can meet the environmental review criteria is made either by a plan reviewer, that's a city staff member, or a hearings officer, and that decision is a discretionary decision. So I'm going to go through some examples. This is kind of wonky speak, but hopefully some diagrammatic examples can kind of illustrate how the approval processes work a little bit more. This is an imaginary site that has a stream running through the middle of it. There is a protection overlay zone that's a buffer around that stream of a specified width. And then beyond that buffer of the protection zone, conservation zone that's applied to all the contiguous forest vegetation that's around that stream. So somebody might come in and say, I want to develop this site and I want to build my house in the back corner that's away from the street, behind the stream. And they would have to cross that stream with some kind of driveway or something, and maybe put the stream in a culvert, remove a number of trees around the building footprint and where the driveway is going in to facilitate that development. This is a fairly impactful proposal, but somebody might propose and want to do it that way. There's an alternative. You could do it in this corner of the lot. You could shrink the building footprint, make it a little bit smaller, have a shorter driveway, not cross the stream, minimize the tree removal. And of these two proposals, this one probably could meet standards. It depends. It may be that they can't meet some setback requirements from the stream, or that they need to remove too many trees for some reason. So if they can't meet the standards, then you go to this discretionary environmental review process. And again, when you get into that discretionary review process, you need to consider all the possible alternative layouts, determine which one is the least impactful to the natural resources, and that is the one that can be determined by the plan reviewer to be approvable. In the process, there will be some mitigation that will be required, though, because there probably will be some tree removal. And so mitigation is typically tree replacement, the removal of invasive species, and planting native species, and in a way that's commensurate with the impacts to the natural resources, in a way that replaces the functions and functional values that are impacted by that development. So we have some proposed amendments to the code that applies to the environmental zones. And again, the main purpose of these amendments is to allow for the approval of public infrastructure projects and the maintenance of natural areas and vegetation, and then some miscellaneous technical amendments as well. So going back to that diagrammatic example that we were looking at, the way I described it before was as if somebody was building a house in the back corner of the lot, and we found a way to develop that lot in a less impactful way. Well, what if in this situation, it's actually a sewage pump station that we want to build? And there's a sewer line that's running along the river bottom, which is a pretty common occurrence. We see that all the time because sewer lines are typically built in low-lying areas, and streams tend to form in relatively low-lying areas. A lot of times these sewers go back decades or even a century, and they're still in operation today. And we have to have structures that are above ground along the way, that are pump stations that move the sewage along and get it to where it needs to go. And oftentimes these pump stations are decades old as well, and in some cases they need to be replaced. When we replace sewage pump stations, typically because our population has grown over the last 50 or 60 years um, and beyond, and also because we have modern building codes, seismic standards, and whatnot, typically when we rebuild a pump station, we have to increase its size. The footprint has to grow. But we can't move it. The sewer line is where it is, and it's not going anywhere. And so when we do an upgrade of the sewer line and an upgrade of the pump station, we're going to rebuild it in the same spot. The alternatives analysis is not going to get us to a new location. The pump station needs to be built where it is. And so it's not really appropriate to go through the environmental review process when there's not really any discretion in where the location of that pump station can be. So we're proposing some amendments that will create standards that will allow for the replacement of those pump stations and thereby avoid that discretionary review process. Those standards do set limits on the total area that the pump station can occupy. They do still, and they also set limits on the amount of trees that can be removed. And the standards that apply to those pump stations would also specify an amount of site enhancement, which would be similar to mitigation that applicants would have to do to offset the impacts to the natural resources. So the limit that we're setting for the expansion, we think is consistent with the types of expansions that would have to occur when a typical pump station is replaced. We are adding the standard to a existing section in the zoning code that applies to flood control structures. So this would also allow for the expansion of flood control structures because the Urban Flood Safety and Water Quality District also manages some pump stations that probably are going to need to be replaced in the near future, so they could avail themselves of these standards as well. There are existing standards that allow for the expansion of flood control structures, but they're really limited in what they can apply to. Currently, they say that only things that allow for human access, such as handrails, stairs, walkways, can be added. Anything that's beyond those would be subject to environmental review. So we're now allowing for expansions of any type that aren't just limited to these human access type features that need to be applied to the outsides of these structures. And so we're also adding an allowance for tree removal to the standard, whereas previously no tree removal was allowed, but we are requiring replacement anytime trees are removed. So that's the flood station and pump station and flood control structure amendments. Now we'll move on to the natural areas management amendments. This is the second of the 4 categories of amendments. So this allows for the removal of small native trees in city managed natural areas. This allows city staff to promote specific habitat types and to prevent the overcrowding of trees as small trees are growing up. This is something that's regularly undertaken by city staff, but currently these types of activities would technically be subject to environmental review. We're allowing for the installation of beaver management devices, which are sometimes referred to as beaver deceivers or flow control devices. There's a certain subset of these types of structures that can be installed. Previously, they would have had to go through environmental review because they're typically installed within the banks of a water body. And so we're allowing these to happen by exemption instead of going through environmental review. The installation of these devices is fairly unimpactful, so there's no real mitigation that's required. And it's important to allow these structures to be installed because we want beavers in the environment. Beavers are an important keystone species. They enhance and create habitat, but they can also be a nuisance if they're in somebody's backyard and they're backing up a stream into somebody's basement, or if they're near a roadway and the beaver dams are causing flooding of roadways. So we want to be able to manage the beaver impact without having to remove them lethally, which is the typical way that beavers are managed currently. So this allows for the coexistence with beavers. We're also allowing floating structures to be installed within water bodies. These floating structures are like a vegetated wetland structure that provides habitat for salmon and steelhead. The reason we're doing that is because we have a lot of water bodies that run through levee controlled areas, and you can't really plant trees on levees. So this allows for the installation of vegetation within the water body itself that can rise and fall with the fluctuating water levels, and provide some habitat for these species that would be using these waterways as migratory channels. We're allowing cultural harvesting of vegetation. There are existing agreements that exist between the Bureau of Environmental Services and the Parks Bureau with specific groups that allow for cultural harvesting activities to take place. Some of these activities happen within environmental zones, but we're now formalizing within the code that applies to the E-zones that these vegetation removal activities are allowed when it's done as part of an agreement with one of these bureaus. And then we're allowing for the management of vegetation on the levees by the Urban Flood Safety and Water Quality District. We have levees that are currently being recertified that are in the Columbia Corridor that prevent flooding in that area. And it's important to remove woody vegetation from the levees because the roots can undermine those levees and render them inoperable. So we're explicitly allowing the vegetation management activities that need to occur on these levees to occur by exemption. The next category of amendments is tree removal and replacement. There are existing exemptions that allow for property owners to remove dead, dying, and dangerous trees from their sites. We have exemptions that are in the tree code. We also have exemptions in the environmental overlays that allow this to happen. But there's a quirk of the code that applies to the environmental overlays that says if you're removing a dead, dying, and dangerous tree by exemption, you can't do it at the time of development. You can only do it in non-development situations. It's a wonky distinction, but it means that if you are going in and building a house and there happens to be a dangerous tree somewhere else on your property that's causing an imminent hazard, you have to remove that tree either before you come in for permitting for that development or after the development is already completed. You can't do it at the same time. We're taking away that prohibition on doing it at the same time as your development. There's also a requirement that if you do remove a dead, dying, and dangerous tree, you need to retain all the big pieces of wood on your lot. Any piece of wood that's greater than 12 inches in diameter under current code needs to stay within the site that it came down on. We are relieving that requirement for smaller sites that have less than 3,000 square feet of E-zone in total. This means that people are going to be able to remove pieces of wood on their site if they only have a small area of E-zone there, because currently the current requirements are leading to situations where people's entire backyards are being taken up by big dead trees, and that can be problematic on some smaller sites. And then we are amending the standards to allow a smaller number of trees to be removed within the E-zones and development situations than is currently allowed. This is because when you remove a tree, the code specifies a replacement ratio. And if you're doing development that requires a large number of trees to be removed, then you're required to replant an even larger number of trees elsewhere on the site. And what we found is that the number of trees that are specified to be replaced or required to be replaced is so great that very few sites actually have adequate space to do the required replanting. So we're cutting down on the number of trees that can be removed from a site to make it more consistent with the amount of area that you're likely to have to replant trees. In addition to that, we're also allowing for a revegetation fee to be used as a fee in lieu of on-site replacement for native tree removal. We already had a revegetation fee that was part of the environmental overlay zone code. And previously that revegetation fee was managed and dispersed by the Bureau of Environmental Services. It was a not very widely used option because the definition of how the fee was assessed and when it could be used was fairly limited in the code, and it was unclear previously. So we're clarifying how that revegetation fee is assessed. We're reassigning it to urban forestry, who has a bureau that has experience managing fee in lieu funds like this for the purpose of replanting trees. And we are clarifying how that fee is assessed when it is used for tree removal, exactly how many increments of the fee need to be paid when a tree is removed. So it's clarifying the code and hopefully allowing for this fee in lieu to be used more widely than it currently is. Also, we have wildfire hazard tree removal. So we know that our region is becoming more susceptible to wildfire than it had been previously. We also know that there are important infrastructure such as water bureau tanks that are located in oftentimes forested areas. We have a whole bunch of water bureau tanks in Forest Park, other places in the West Hills that are part of our designated wildfire hazard zone. And historically, trees have kind of been allowed to grow up and around these structures because there was not a great perceived risk of wildfire. Well, our understanding of the wildfire risks in our region has changed and is evolving. With climate change, we know that the incidence of wildfire in our region is only becoming more and more common. And we know that these structures are vulnerable to fires, even though they tend to be made out of things like steel and concrete. They have critical components that actually deliver the water. So even if the structure itself might not be damaged by a fire, the pipes that run from these structures to the distribution systems, the electronic controls, the plastic fittings that are part of these systems that deliver the water are actually susceptible to damage from wildfire. And even from the heat of a fire that's near the structure itself. So we are proposing to allow the clearance of trees within a specified radius around these public infrastructure structures. So water tanks, sewage pump stations, electrical substations, emergency communication facilities. If it's in a wildfire hazard zone and an E-zone, you can remove the trees that are within a 30-foot radius of these structures. And again, it's only within match wildfire hazard zone, so it's fairly limited. And if you remove a tree, we're going to require the replacement of that tree elsewhere within the environmental zones. And we're hoping to limit that tree removal to the same watershed, so you can't remove a tree on the west side of the city and then plant another tree somewhere else on the east side. If you're doing it in Forest Park or in the Southwest, then you need to replace in that general geographic location where the tree removal is occurring. And this is a map of the wildfire hazard zone. So anything that's colored in on this map is an area that is a designated wildfire hazard zone. And those are the areas where this wildfire related tree removal would be allowed to occur. And then finally, we have this last category of amendments. These are our miscellaneous technical amendments. So we have some very specific public noticing requirements that only apply to the E-zones. There are general public noticing requirements that apply anytime you're doing development in the city that's above a certain level of impact. If you're building more than 10,000 square feet of area for a building, you always have to do a whole set of public noticing requirements. You have to post your proposed development on a city website. You have to post a sign on the site. You have to do some mailings and things like that. Those apply anytime you're doing development in the city. But there was another public noticing requirement that only applied to the E-zones. It applied to development of any scale. So it wasn't just anything over 10,000 square feet. It was anytime you're doing any development proposal at all, you needed to go through a similar set of public noticing requirements. And it only applied when the development was proposed through the standards. So if you went through environmental review and it was a small scale development, you didn't have to do public noticing. But if you go through the standards, you do. So it was a weird set of requirements. We felt that it's overly onerous and burdensome. And these noticing requirements also included a public review period where people could make comments to the people that were reviewing the plan. But because these are because these noticing requirements only applied when review happened through standards, there's no discretion that the plan reviewers have when approving or denying the project. So the public comment really was not able to be impactful on the review process because the reviewers were really just looking to see if the development proposal met standards or not. So we're removing the special public review period that was applied for development that went through standards in the E-zones because it wasn't beneficial and people typically didn't make comments anyways. We are still requiring that the signs be posted on the site and that the development area that's proposed has to be fenced off. So the area that's being left on the site that's within the E-zones, that's outside of the development area, is fenced off and disturbances are prevented there. And the development information will still be posted on the city website, but this specific public comment period, we're proposing to remove that. We're allowing some amendments, or we're allowing for non-native vegetation to be planted in stormwater planters in E-zones. Currently, if you have to develop a road, and around the city of Portland, new roadway development oftentimes involves the installation of planters that manage stormwater, at least in areas where the soil allows for stormwater infiltration. Currently, the code says if you build a planter that's associated with the road in an environmental zone, you need to plant native vegetation within that planter. What we know from our colleagues at the Bureau of Environmental Services is that typically native vegetation does not survive very well in these planters. It requires more maintenance, and it doesn't really function the way it's intended to. So we're taking away this requirement for native vegetation, but we're still not allowing the planting of invasive species in stormwater planters. So it's non-native, non-invasive species that are more suitable for the purpose can be planted in stormwater planters. We're reducing setback requirements for right-of-way in the development in the transition area. This is the outer 25 feet of any environmental overlay, well, the conservation zone or protection zone, the outer 25 feet at the outer edge is referred to as the transition area. When you're doing private development in the E-zones and your private development is happening within that transition area, there are a few rules and regulations that apply, and there are no setback requirements within that transition area. But currently, the code that applies to right-of-way development does not acknowledge that this transition area is an area that's more permissive for development. And it meant that if you're doing a development that requires the frontage improvement, where you have to build out the right-of-way in front of your house, that you might sometimes trigger environmental review in situations where, if it was not right-of-way development, if it was just building a house or a structure on a private lot, you wouldn't trigger environmental review. So we're basically harmonizing the standards that apply to rights of way with the standards that apply to building development, and reducing the number of situations where people might be subject to environmental review just for building out the frontage of their right of way. We're allowing accessory dwelling units to use an exemption that already applies to houses, to primary structures on sites. So currently, if you have a site that has an environmental zone and you're proposing to do development, you can reduce your front setback from anywhere, depending on the zone. It could be a 10-foot front setback, or it could be a 20-foot front setback that's required by code. You can reduce that front setback to 0 if you want, and build right up on the edge of the lot line. And the reason we allow that to happen is because that can sometimes avoid the impacts to the natural resources, or reduce the impacts to the resources, like we saw in some of those diagrammatic examples that I showed there. So you can already do that for your primary structure, for your house. But if you're building an accessory dwelling unit along with that primary structure, current code says that you need to set that you can't do that 0 lot line development, at least not going through a discretionary review process. So we're just extending that exemption to accessory dwelling units as well, so that they can take advantage of the same code that already applies to the primary structure on the site. And then there are a few other technical amendments that fall within the categories that we've already talked about that are so minor that we didn't even list them on this presentation. However, you can review the documents yourself and dig into all the gritty details. So this URL that's posted on the page here, that will take you to the website that we've set up for this project. We have released a discussion draft. This is our public review draft of the project documents. We are currently in the middle of a public comment period, which will go through May 9th. So you can submit your comments or questions to the email address that's listed on the page there. And you can also sign up to receive periodic project updates. We'll send a few emails here or there when we move on to the further phases of the project, such as public hearings. And when and if we receive final approval, you will also be notified if you sign up for that. So we welcome any comments, questions. Please submit them to the email address that's listed on the page here. And thank you very much for your consideration and attention.